Hello and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey Hall, and I'm a folklore researcher. Dear listener, how are you? And how are you weathering this storm? It appears that many folks are going through an awful lot of issues that are coming up to be cleared at the moment. For some, that's arising through illness, while for others it's simply feeling like a very heavy and exhausting time. To me, it feels like this time calls us to be our authentic selves and to arrange and rearrange our situations in order to support that. Stepping over a threshold, if you will. Getting around to making these decisions is often the hardest part, but it really does get easier from that point onwards. In many ways, the releasing of this episode has been a threshold moment for our guest, who had an extremely disturbing goblin experience in her home in inner city London. More on that shortly, but first I'd like to thank my wonderful supporters, the Curious crew on Patreon, and a special shout out to Kate from Pottstown, who recently joined the Weird Folk tier. This project would not exist without the crew's ongoing help and loving support. The Discord community has been a real joy to hang out in lately, so thank you. We have a community Zoom next week, including a talk on lucid dreaming by one of our members. If you can support the podcast for £3 a month, come and join us on patreon.com/the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast. Please also subscribe and leave a rating on your app and leave a review. Share the show with a friend and subscribe to the YouTube channel, where I'll be uploading all the video versions as I get time. You can also contact me via the website at scarletofthefae.com, where you'll find the show notes, and on scarletofthefae@gmail.com. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at _remain_curious. I'm very grateful to our guest for sharing the following story. It's the first of 2 parts. As I say, it's been difficult for them to even talk about it. It all began when they moved into an apartment in inner city London in 2018. What happened next is like something straight out of a supernatural horror film and involves goblins. Now, some listeners will find this very frightening. I recommend that it's not suitable for listeners who are sensitive to creepy content. As always, none of these episodes are suitable for children. I hope you enjoy hearing this, and I'll be back at the end for a chat. Time to
So this was about, I think, between January and March 2018. It was a very cold night. I was in the house I was renting, or the flat I was renting on my own, which was a ground floor converted studio in a big, I think, sort of Victorian turn of the century house with big bay windows. And it was a really lovely conversion. They'd kept the sort of the original features and stuff and the day rail at the top, but they put in some huge sliding doors to compartmentalize the bedroom and the bathroom areas with these huge theatrical sliding doors, which went right back into the wall. And it was a beautiful floor, like walnut, with nice modern furniture, and it looked lovely. But the first night I moved in, which was actually a year before, I had left a previous partner and we'd split up, and it wasn't like a very stressful time. It was unsettling, but it wasn't the most dramatic thing I've ever gone through. And I put all my stuff into storage and I moved into this flat. And the first night I was there, I woke up in the middle of the night and I could hear sort of pinging, tapping noises, like gravel being thrown. And I kind of thought, oh, that's a bit odd, and was super aware of this and went back to sleep. It was probably, again, about 3 o'clock in the morning. And then the next day or the couple of days afterwards, I started to see at night along the top of the kitchen unit. So, because it's an open plan space, I'd be watching TV and I'd see little flickery, darty shadows. And I was thinking, this is really odd. Is it the lights? Is it me? Is it mice? But it was out of the corner of my eye. And I was just more and more aware. My senses were very heightened in this space and I couldn't understand why. But as time went on, the TV would switch itself on, the kettle would boil itself, things would fall over, things would fly off a shelf for no reason. I had a pot of strawberry jam fly out of a kitchen cupboard, like from a great height, and it smashed the sort of ceramic, very high-tech hob top underneath, which was bizarre. Things started to go missing. Oh, just silly things like safety pins and spoons. And the lady who had the flat before me, she told me that she had a bracelet still missing and could I find it? Well, it was a tiny space and there was nowhere, it could have gone. I've still got a pair of earrings missing, which are very pretty and gold and glittery and dangly, and they're still missing. I don't know where they are. And as time went by, it just got more and more of a strange place to be. And I had friends visit and I had a couple of members of my family come round and they were all a bit on edge when they came round, and they were just like, how could you live in this? It's so strange, it's so electrified. And I just couldn't kind of put my finger on it, but at the same time was having to live there because I'd had nowhere else to go at that point. My stuff was in storage. It was a bit of a liminal, weird passage of time. And the more and more I go on and think about it, the more and more I realized that I was very tuned into this house. And as the time went by, I realized I had to leave it because it was very dark. I had some very dark moments in there, disembodied voices, people saw things, other people could hear their name being called if they came round to visit. Gosh. And and as the night in question went on, as the time went on, I remember getting up in the middle of the night. And I hadn't been out partying, nothing particularly, there's no drink involved with this whatsoever. And I think, as I said, between January and March 2018, and I remember distinctly getting up in the middle of the night, going to the bathroom. So there's these sliding door things. And I left the door open because the moonlight was so strong. This is ground floor, very flimsy curtains, and also there was a street light outside, which was kind of off the drive onto the pathway. Yeah. And as I went into the bathroom, I didn't shut the door because it was just me, and the door remained slid back, so back into the wall, with this moonlight behind, so you could see the wooden floor, and the bathroom had a stone floor, so it was a tiny space. And I remember turning around to the bathroom and looking down at the hinge of the door, and I could see something moving. I had to take a double take because I was just like, oh my God, what? Oh my goodness. And in front of me, probably a little bit bigger than a mobile phone, were two, what can only be described as, I keep calling them goblins, but they were kind of elf-like goblin-y things. They were avocado-y, greeny, dark greeny grey colour because the light wasn't that. I think I had the bathroom, must have had the bathroom light on, but I could see them enough for it to be this distinct. And I realised they were moving because one was quite chubby and the other one was on its shoulders. And they were trying to see round the door and they were pointing and giggling at me. And I was like, oh my, this isn't happening. This cannot be happening. This is not real. This can't be happening. But it was long enough for me to really see their little faces and, see they felt very evil. And that's the word I sort of, it wasn't cute fairy with little wings or anything like that. They were very mischievous, very naughty. And they had very pointed features, like real, as you probably saw from my drawing, really kind of hooked nose and massive ears. Huge ears. But in that moment, because it went on long enough for me to kind of go, oh my God, they're moving. It wasn't like a snapshot image where you see a gnome in your head or something like that. They were actually moving and squirming. And I think I had a realization of me going, oh my God, this is what has been jumping around in this flat.
Yeah.
This is what I haven't seen. And this is you. And I, I can imagine I gasped probably at this point. And in the sort of seconds before they disappeared, it wasn't a kind of out of body experience because, well, this was a massive shock. I mean, as you probably have, as you've explained and stuff in other parts of your podcast, the boggle factor was blown. I mean, I didn't know what to do at this point. And I was stuck in the bathroom with these things in front of me. But the weirdest thing happened, and it's not like it was a smell, because smell's not the word, but you know how smell can change the atmosphere of a room?
Yeah.
And you feel like a smell can literally change your senses and your sense of perspective. It was like that. It was like I'd gone into another dimension in those moments. I didn't know where I was, but I hadn't gone into like a space or anything like that. It was just the enormity of taking on the fact that I was seeing these things and going, oh my God. So somehow they didn't cross the threshold, by the way. They didn't cross from the floor into the stones. They didn't come towards me. They just stayed at that edge, like peeking around, like they knew they couldn't go any further. I don't know if they knew they'd seen me, but because they suddenly vanished. I then, in a total state of panic, rushed into the main room and my heart was pounding. I remember shaking. I'm a bit shaky now. And, threw all the lights on, started Googling, as you do, gnomes in houses, goblins in houses. I don't know what I was doing, but I was so nervous about even doing that because I thought, oh God, the phone company will find out. I was so, what's the word? Not embarrassed, but I was just horrified. I was just like, what do you do? I mean, this is never, ever, I mean, even in my wildest dreams, if I ever imagined I would see anything like this, but it was such a frightening experience. And also, it'd been a long run up to this point of creepy things happening, odd things happening, as I said, jumping shadows, things disappearing, the feeling of not being alone in there. I used to sit with tea lights around me and candles around me because I knew there was something not right about this place.
Yeah.
And when I ran out of tea lights, oh my God, that was a terrible night because it was so dark. It was beyond dark, if that makes any sense, in that flat. And I mean, it didn't happen again. I didn't see them again, but I have found out since that friends have told me years later that they didn't like that bathroom.
Okay. Which
is very interesting. And the lady who was there before me said to me once, she said, oh, there are imps in houses. And I said, what? I said, I just looked at her and I'd never told her this story, actually. I've never told her this story, but she said, there are imps in houses. And I thought, oh my gosh, she's just, she's saying mad things. This is just not possible.
Yeah.
And since then, I didn't tell anybody. I just swallowed it. I just thought, I don't know what that was. I think it must have been a moment of madness. People just think I'm crazy. But I told a couple of people, about 2 years ago. And it's interesting. I told someone and he said that he'd had a friend who'd had an experience out in a sort of car park where something kicked his tires. He came out to find something running away from the car, which he couldn't explain.
Yeah.
And slowly people have kind of told me things, but not really. I didn't know what to do with this story at all. I didn't know where to even start. I mean, Google hasn't got that much, to be honest. There were some horrifying stories of people as children having in bed at night, seeing goblins coming down the walls. And I thought, I know how frightening this is. This isn't funny. This is not a laughing matter. I mean, at that point in time, did I think that I was going mad? No, it was probably the most bland passage of time I've been in, but in a very limbo-esque sort of point. I was certainly not, doing anything magical. I wasn't tuning into anything. It was a kind of liminal space. And I think because that particular house had been sort of converted and then left, it was ground floor, as I said, so it wasn't like the first floor or second floor or anything like that. It had a big rambling garden at the back. And as time went on, other strange things happened in that house. And actually, I realized I had to leave, and I was trying to find somewhere else to move to, and the spooky things were starting to ramp up. And then, very strangely, a builder who was working for the landlord in the garden inexplicably fell off a very short ladder and had a terrible head injury. Yeah, and was found, luckily, by the landlord. And it I did think much, a while later, did he see something which freaked him out and he fell? I could be wrong, but, that's me just clutching at straws. But this was something, and it still is something, that it fascinates me that happened to me. And if anything, it kind of it's strengthened my intuition as to who I am and what the potential is within me, and not about seeing the fae or fairies or goblins or anything like that. But that was very real. That was real enough for me to throw all the lights on. I woke up the next morning, the lights were still on. Yeah, because I was so frightened. I mean, I don't want to go there again. That was pretty scary. They were not nice little beasts at all. They weren't cute little fairies. They were giggling. And I mean, you might say, I thought at the time, is it just my paranoia? Am I manifesting this? What am I doing? But I've never seen anything like it in my life. I don't watch those types of films. I'm not a Dungeons and Dragons person. I might have read some Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe when I was much, much younger, but it was not a current theme for me at all.
No.
And I guess I'm still, I do wonder whether they can follow you. I wonder whether I brought them to this flat. I moved shortly afterwards, and about 6 months afterwards, actually. And I got here and I felt a sense of relief because everything was so normal and there was no weird stuff going on. But at the same time, I kind of missed that place because it was, if there's anywhere that would convince anyone that there's another dimension or there are other dimensions, it was that building.
Yeah. And
it was, I've had experiences when I was much, much younger of like paranormal stuff and ghostly things, and oh gosh, I'm a very intuitive person, but I've never experienced, even as a child, as far as I can remember, have I experienced anything like that. Right. But the only thing that does make me wonder whether under, I don't know, maybe hypnosis or something like that, maybe I would reach further back into memory, is when that happens in that bathroom, I got a sense of familiarity.
Yes, this is a thing.
Yeah. Am I saying all the right things here? I don't know, because these are things that only I would know because I was there. Yeah. But there was a sense of familiarity of like, I know what you are. I know you're here, and it was almost like a kind of it was a sort of almost like a cheeky, oh my God, it's you,
recognition.
A recognition. That's the word I was looking for. And I for the ability to do that spontaneously has made me think, gosh, what else could I, what else is possible? But also, what are we not being told? Is there a frequency that I was on at that point? Is it because I was not kind of probably doing a 9-to-5 job? I was living very much on my own somewhere that was quite an old part of London, and didn't have, the Wi-Fi quite often got cut off there. Was it because I was in that space that I was able to see that? Was it because I'd taken myself away from normal kind of, London society, as it were? I don't know, but I've tried to kind of not rationalize it, but it was such an extreme, scary moment for me. And obviously I had to carry on living in this flat. And I was like, oh boy, this is not funny. What do I do? So I kind of just pretended it didn't happen. But the next day I was still shaking. And I remember speaking to the landlord afterwards and saying, do you not hear these noises? Because, I could hear and I could not see, but I could understand there were sort of jumpy little things around all over the place.
Right. So after that, you could then pick out, right? Yeah,
I could understand it more. But yes, it was a familiarity and a recognition of And I do wonder now whether I've blocked out other memories of stuff, and I don't know. But this is not something that, I don't go around seeing things. I have had, some really interesting paranormal experiences energetically, and other stuff that people have witnessed around me. And I think that's the good thing with me, is that most people actually get to see it with me, and it's not a kind of lone experience. Usually with stuff with me, I have, things have moved around with me. I've had, things flying off tables and stuff like that. But actually I'm kind of, that's easier to kind of go, oh, that didn't really happen. But seeing these types of little impy things in London was just, I still don't know what to do with it. I don't know what they were. I mean, trying to find them, were they little brownies and things like that. I've had friends recently saying to me, oh, I'd love a brownie in my house. I'm like, no, you wouldn't.
No,
because
exactly.
It's not what you think. I've been horrified. And I just was going to say to them, do you really know what you're dealing with? Because I don't know what I'm dealing with. I don't feel like I have any knowledge of this. I don't know what they were. I mean, they were, as I said, greeny, avocado-y skinned. They didn't really have clothes, I don't think. I mean, if they did, it was raggedy. It wasn't little suits and cute things, like little waistcoats or anything. They looked quite feral.
Yeah.
And they looked like they were mean little, they were ratters. They obviously do the kind of, knocking over bins type thing.
Yeah.
And the fact that they were so cheeky and like trying to see me around the doorway. And I've often replayed this many times. If it wasn't for the fact that all the other stuff also makes, if I'd just seen a flash of these, I'd probably think, oh, I was just going mad. But it was the fact that all these jumpy things, the flickering shadows, the things falling over, stuff disappearing. There's a strange passage of time in that house. And it's almost sort of jettisoned me into writing about it myself, but I don't have the answers. And I think one person doesn't have them all. I think you have to piece it all together and, do a lot of research.
Healing has helped me many times in my life when I'd reached a point where something needed to change. In 2005, I trained with Martin Brofman to learn the body mirror system of healing, which was life-changing for me. It's based on the idea that the parts of your body that don't work well reflect the parts of your life that don't work well, and about which you have tension in your consciousness. The understanding is that tension is stress, and stress causes symptoms. In a distance healing or in-person session, I move up the chakras, returning each one to wholeness using a colour map. During the process, I see images and situations, I hear words or receive impressions that tell me something about what caused the tension in that person's life. The feedback at the end of the session is a really big part of the healing. If you're interested in a chakra healing session, you can contact me at scarletofthefae@gmail.com. I think it would help to write about it, though. I think that would be a really good idea, because it helps you to sort of reflect on it as well. And is there a part of you that is worried about conjuring them up again, if you like, or invoking them through your writing?
Yeah, I've thought, I mean, when I did that little drawing for you, that took a lot actually for me to do that. Yeah. Because I had to go into that moment again, and I started to write it out a couple of times. That's the first time actually I started to write it out knowing I was going to speak to you, and it's the first time ever I put that pen to paper, because partly because of the stigmatism. I thought if anybody ever finds this, they'll just think I'm mad. And it's taken a lot of courage to be able to get to that point. But the good news is, or the interesting news is that I've started to look into folklore like really properly, and was even looking at MAs and postgrads in folklore, because I thought, well,
brilliant.
I think I might be a bit more in tune with this than most people.
Yeah.
And I probably have buried the ability to do this, or I've ignored it or any of the above, and perhaps this is the true me coming through.
Yeah.
And as I said, intuition wise, if there was anywhere that was going to say to me, big pointy arrow, this is, the moment where you have to see this big arrow from above is saying to you, it's real. Anything that you really see in front of you like this has happened. I mean, dimension wise, I can't explain it. I don't know. I have no idea. I'm not that au fait with folklore to know what they were or how old they were or why they were there or any of this, or how we exist with them in this world that we know. I don't know, but it's fascinated me, and it's sprungboard me into finding out a lot more, I think. And also in terms of painting, because I come from a sort of historically an arty background, you see all these incredible pictures of elves and goblins and all these different things. That's not a fantasy world. That's things that people have seen.
Yeah.
It's the other way around. It's not the fantasy. It's not a fantasy world. It's real.
Yeah.
And they were probably painting things they'd actually seen. And it's a strange thing to say that, but I thought about it hard, because some of these were sort of like, the 17th century or the 18th century, or coming up to sort of the turn of the century, where more and more, cute fairies were coming through in paintings. But I think it's because they actually saw them. I don't think, because why else would you put a wing on a tiny being like that? Do you have any ideas yourself of what they might have been?
It does sound like a goblin-y little imp. And these goblins, as you know, because you'll have heard some guests on the podcast already talk about this, they can behave in ways that are very frightening, and they seem to like scaring people as well. They seem to take enjoyment. So I think, I suppose, one way to deal with them, I mean, I haven't had a really scary goblin experience. Touch wood. I have
hope you
felt,
don't.
I have felt presences before that, were a bit pokey and made me feel a bit scared, if you know what I mean. So, but my response to that would be quite tough, actually. I'm not sure whether you ever called on any protection at that time. Did you? At that point?
Not really. I mean, I remember saging the place a couple of times, but that wasn't really doing much good.
It didn't do anything. No.
Well, it kind of, I don't know. I mean, I saged the place a couple of times, and because at this point, a few of us, a few people, we had actually seen orbs in there, and I was starting to think, little sparkles, like little orbs.
Yeah.
And around people as well, like tiny. I remember taking photographs of the guy I was seeing at the time, and I could see, as I was doing it, around him, not through the camera, but I could see all these tiny little orbs all around him.
Yeah.
Sprinkles.
I mean, these are very interesting, and my and many other people, I'm sure, idea of orbs, because I see orbs around people as well, usually when they're talking about something that's really meaningful to them, or their truth. You start to see these flashes around them, and it is interesting. It happens all the time. I mean, this week already, funny. I've sat, talking to somebody in a meeting just at work, and noticing, sparks happen around them when they're talking about various things. There can be a couple of different explanations for orbs. I think when you see them like that around somebody, it's often, as I said, it's kind of like a thought manifesting. And everything is energy. We are energy. Everything is energy. These beings are energy. And if you, at the very sort of, at the level of pure energy, a thought can be represented as an orb, as can a being.
Wow.
Right? So these imps, or it could have been other presences in that place that were attracted for the same reason as the imps were in that house or in that flat. So the orbs, I'm sensing you didn't get quite the same vibe off the orbs as you did the goblins, though. What was the vibe from the orbs?
The orbs was much, when you say about truth, that's very interesting, because the conversations we were having at that point was about playing music. And the person I was seeing, I think, what did he have? He had a flute with him.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, this is lovely. And he hadn't played it in years, and he had it with him in a box. And the reason why I was taking photographs is he was going to sell this thing because it was very old and it was kind of past its, prime.
Yeah.
And he was playing it. And that's when I saw these little, you can make this up, but this is when I saw these little orbs. It's jogged my memory now.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Did you keep the photos?
I've got them somewhere, but I don't know whether I'll have to dig them out and see if I can find them.
Interesting to look at those.
To go back.
As long as you're ready to, of course, because, as you say, it brings up a lot, doesn't it? It doesn't take much. Because again, it's energy. It's energy.
Wow, that's made me go shivery. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's energy. And you know what? Something else happened tonight. This I tried to decipher, but when we were in that flat, this has nothing to do with the elves. Well, maybe it is. I remember sitting in my bedroom and he came in. This is the guy I was seeing, came in and he had his back to me. And he'd taken his t-shirt off and he had his back to me. He was just talking to me. And I remember turning over and I was looking at him. And all the way over his skin, this is down his back, was this moving energy. I can't describe it. It was like a white light force moving like a snake, but it was completely white. It was like the whole of him wasn't real. That's not the right expression. And I remember just sitting at the time going, oh my God, I'm actually seeing this. I must be going mad.
Yeah.
So many strange things happened in that flat. It was unbelievable. But it was like a kind of, the Alien versus Predator type thing where they go transparent.
Yes.
When it was almost like you could see, I couldn't see organs. I could only see all this light moving around him.
Yeah. This is sort of stretching it too far in terms of what you wanted to talk about. But,
no,
not everybody is from here.
I know what you're going to say.
Is from here. And, I've met people before that when I tuned into them, it became very apparent that they weren't human beings. Essentially, they had come from somewhere else and they were here in this lifetime. And so, sometimes you can pick that up. They have this extra quality about them that you can sense that they're not quite of this world.
Yeah.
Just wondering if that's
I think that unfortunately does resonate with this particular person. And it's funny you should say that. It took me years to understand what happened. You find these things out by chance because there's no Wikipedia for this. No. There's no explanation anywhere. And I actually heard someone who said that a similar experience had happened to him when they'd also gone into this strange kind of transparency. And I didn't get that until I've overheard other people saying what you've just said, that it could have been an otherworldly type, and it's a different subject, but maybe it was all piled up and this flat was just coincidental that this all came out because I was meant to see it.
Yeah,
I think now that these were pivotal moments, and this is again, as a child I used to love the idea of going off into the woods and going out looking for fairies, and my mum would kind of say, the fairy circles and the mushrooms and toastals, all this sort of stuff. But it was all fantasy. It was not kind of, it was make-believe and very exciting. And there's a possibility that, you could catch something or you could see something in the woods. But as I said, to be seeing it at, I don't know what I was, 46 or something at the time, was just knocked me out of the park. And as much as I have a huge imagination, and since that passage of time, I've very much got into kind of, especially during lockdown, was my sort of spiritual, right, I have to sort this out. I can't keep avoiding this. But there are not answers to everything. And it's lovely to speak to somebody like you and to listen to all the other stuff on the podcast, because other people are experiencing this as well. And we're all trying to make sense of it. And even in our most, I think it was an extremely special experience. And do I wish it would happen every day? Not particularly those things, because they were really, I think it made me feel even more lonely in a way, or alone, because I thought, oh, well, they're not even cute. They're not little cute little fluffy things at all. They were even more unnerving. But seeing this sort of the energy in that place was off the Richter scale. It was quite something. And the only other person that I've heard describe it so well was actually, is it the Perrin family who lived in the original Conjuring house? I can't remember. It is Perrin.
Right.
And I heard, so during this passage of time, I couldn't kind of follow paranormal stuff or anything particularly spooky on YouTube. I just didn't want to bring it into the house. Every time I tried, things would start pinging around the flat, or I watched something on TV and it was just like, oh no, this is not good. So I had which makes it even more obvious when things were happening. But I remember afterwards listening to one of the Perrin sisters say that walking back into the house, I don't know, I keep calling it the Conjuring house, but she walked back in after many, many years, and she said it was like walking into a bubble. And that is how I felt with that house. I was walking into another dimension or a time slip or something. I mean, I remember waking up in the middle of the night and I honestly thought someone had come into the flat. I could smell cigarette smoke. I could hear breathing. And I woke up in a panic and I could feel a presence. And I remember getting out of bed and like literally going around the flat looking. I thought someone had walked back in with keys. And it was the most freaky experience. I don't know whether it's because of where the building was or the area. I mean, whether it's a vibrational thing or whether we're all living on one particular frequency at the moment and for some reason we can't see beyond it. And maybe I got a glimpse, or maybe there is such a portal possibility that might have happened in that area or that building.
Yeah,
someone
I'm
else.
wondering whether somebody even, I mean, we don't know who lived in it before. Do you feel it was particularly historical area for any reason? But the thing that I'm kind of thinking of here is who was living there before and what were they doing? And if it were a basement flat or if it were a basement space, were they even, we have no idea, but could they have been working some kind of conjuring themselves down there?
Well, it was ground floor rather than basement. Yes, yes. So it's ground floor. So I was garden level.
Right. Yeah.
But down the road, there's a stream apparently running through it and ley lines.
Right. Okay.
So
do you know if they would sort of cross near the house then?
I don't know. I need to look into that. That's one thing I do need to look into. But you're right. We don't know whether because it's probably 1920s, 1910 house. We don't know whether back in those days people were all doing all sorts of stuff.
Well, because of the First World War. People really got into spiritualism and they did dabble and get interested in the afterlife and what happens, of course, because they lost loved ones and had some questions and needed answers and needed connection with those that had passed. So there was a big surge of interest back then. And of course, we're just surmising, we could never know what happened there. But it is interesting to look at where it was then. Was it on a crossroads?
Yes.
It was.
Yes, okay. Yes. It's at the top of a hill on a crossroads. Funny enough,
right?
Yes, pretty much. Yeah, it's pretty much on a crossroads. And funnily enough, there was a gentleman I spoke to a while ago who'd also had to have his house was not opposite, but on the other side of the crossroads. And as a student, they'd had to get the vicar in to exorcise it.
Blimey.
I didn't know that when I started talking to him. And it was only until I started telling my story that he stopped the chat that we were having, the Zoom chat, and said, I've had the same experience. I was like, oh my goodness. And then a couple of years ago, so 2 years ago, 18 months ago, I was talking to a couple of spiritual friends of mine who'd also lived in the area. And I was reciting this story, not about the imps, but about the hauntedness. They came out with similar stories of people in the area, how they'd had to try and do house clearances because it was such an active area.
Blimey.
And my story of, the doors and the electric kettles and stuff, I bought a new kettle. It was that ridiculous. It kept boiling itself. And, all those sort of doors opening and shutting and things like that, they'd not experienced that. but they'd heard of people who had. And it's amazing what happens when you have the sort of the guts to tell one story, how it all starts coming out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think there's then reassurance that you're not going mad, because I mean, I was very much, well, I knew I had to leave this building because I needed to move further into London for myself to get back to work. But it was, as an accidental experiment, it was extraordinary and could give me writing material probably for the rest of my life.
Well, there are some say there are no coincidences, and so
yes,
it's if maybe you at some very deep part of your consciousness chose to step into that space to experience this, there's a lot that you can take from it as well.
Yeah.
And I would encourage you to go and study, do an MA. There's one down, I think, is it in Hertfordshire?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a really good one there. Kerry Holbrook perhaps designed it in the first place, but that's a really good one. So yeah, I'd say go for it. So back to the experience.
Yes.
Did you get eye contact with them when they were?
This is a very interesting point, because I've tried to play that back in my head a couple of times. I remember them wriggling. I remember the slightly skinnier one who's sort of, they were pointing, he was pointing and the other one was sort of trying to shoo him away or get him back so I wouldn't see them. I don't think they saw me at first because of the angle of where I was standing at, because they were smaller than me, obviously, and it seemed to be like a sort of delay. This is an interesting thing. It was like they didn't see me at first. It was like a sort of delay of them seeing through something or seeing me.
Yeah.
Because I think they thought they were covered. I think they thought they were in the dark. It was, not in the dark, but you know what I mean, in the gloom of this. And I think there was a sort of delay, because I was thinking, they're pointing at me. How can they not know that I can see them? And then I realized they probably couldn't. And I was wondering about that, because that was quite interesting as well. And then they just vanished. So I don't know. I mean, they must have twigged that I'd spotted them, because I gasped.
Yeah.
Because I was kind of like, and as I say, I've got a fairly big iPhone, so they were not teeny tiny, matchbox sizes. No, not at all. They were definitely phone sized. So
when you say phone size, because I've got a smaller phone, so
that's a good question.
Like inches? Are we talking centimeters?
So I'd say, yeah, exactly. I'd say about 10 inches, 9 inches.
That's fairly sizable, actually.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Not teeny tiny, not teeny, but big enough for me to see them, because I was, maybe slightly smaller than that, but they weren't matchbox size. They weren't like, a cute little tiny sort of thing that you'd have on your bookshelf. They were enough for me to get to really see that they were sitting there or were standing there, and with the moonlight and the street light behind them, it was like not a silhouette, but it was enough for me to sort of make out that they were greeny grey, and they had quite glittery little yellow eyes, and very big ears, and both had pointed noses, but they looked very ugly.
Did you hear anything? Did you get a sort of sound experience at the same time as a visual experience at all?
That's tricky. That's very tricky. I had thought that, could I hear anything at the sound? I think it was like a sort of minor scuffling, but it was enough to alert me to something that was moving and sort of scuffling. And the bathroom was wasn't like your archetypal bathroom either. It was a very modern bathroom with a see-through shower.
Yeah.
Stand-in shower. And it was very kind of, as I said, it's very quite theatrical in a way, quite exposed.
Yeah.
And this sliding door was back. So they were at the hinge point where the door, it was incredibly high ceilinged, like a theatrical kind of slidey partitions. They were peeping around that, but they were, when I say peeping, it wasn't just their faces. I could see their little bodies.
Yeah.
And the bottom one was very chunky, and the other one was kind of skinny both had long arms. And I think that the weirdest thing was that sort of, maybe there was a smell, but I didn't know what the smell was. So I couldn't identify the smell.
Yeah.
And that's why it changed the atmosphere.
What kind of What kind
sort
of
of dank, sort of patchouli,
Right.
musky smell.
Yes, interesting. So I don't know if you've read any of Josh Cutchin's work, but
No.
he came on the show at one point as well. So we talked
Mm-hmm.
about his book, which is The Brimstone Deceit.
Okay, I'm writing
Yeah,
this down. Mm-hmm.
he's done a whole study on all sorts of experiences. Not many of them Fae like, but then
Mm-hmm.
there are lots that are similar to sort of Fae experiences anyway. He talks about the different smells, and that musky smell is one of them that does come up.
Uh,
Um,
I think that
and
was interesting to me because it was the fact that my senses were heightened by visual, the
yeah,
visual experience and being caught out on the loo or not standing, in
well,
the
yeah,
toilet
because
of
you're
all the
vulnerable.
places.
You're vulnerable, and that's in the same way that they appear to people at their times of vulnerability. Obviously, you were saying you'd just gone through a breakup.
Yep.
You were, just moved into a place. You were sort of between jobs and
Yep.
not particularly in a routine at that point. And, at that moment, you are probably doing one of the most sort of vulnerable acts we do as human
Yes.
beings when we,
Yes.
go to the toilet. As women, it's the middle of the night.
Yep.
Obviously, there's always a worry about intruders, etc., etc. And then they, there they
And then
are.
they appear.
Yeah, that's it. So I don't think that's a coincidence either. And also, they are very cheeky.
Oh my goodness.
Fairies are just very mischievous, and anything to do with, they are very naughty in that regard. So, there is that. But was there a sense of just extreme fear for you
Yes.
then at that moment? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
And it's actually really nice to. I'm a bit shaky now.
yeah.
And quite shivery. But it's been quite a lovely process. I will say thank you very much for what you do because obviously there's been a bit of time between us getting in contact and speaking. I have listened to other people talking. I mean, there's nothing like the experience. I mean, everyone's is different.
Yeah.
But what is so lovely is the camaraderie, but also being able to. I've never in a million years thought I'd be speaking to someone about this, and I thought that yesterday. I thought, oh my goodness, how did I get here? This is extremely. This is surprised me, and I think what's so lovely is that from a personal point of view, it's made me find my voice.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was not that anything particularly like that has happened again immediately. It hasn't. I mean, I suspect it probably will, but it might not be quite the same thing. I don't know. Maybe they're all different, but it's certainly given me an insight and also the patience to listen to other people when they tell you these stories because I believe them. I totally believe them.
This is it. And I think, before we have these experiences ourselves, it's very hard to get our heads around it. And you're right, there is a camaraderie. And I think, to be able to share these experiences with each other is just a massive relief, basically. And it's like, it's like anything. It's part of our experience. And why shouldn't we talk about it? It's really hushed up. But, there are so many of us that have had these sorts of encounters. And I don't think they are as rare as people think. I mean, like you said, you were holding on to, you were talking about some experiences, but then holding this back. How many other people do that? Because, when I first went to speak to people for the book, Magical Folk, I found the same. There were some that people were readily able to talk about, and there were some that were sort of like kept in, in the back. There's this one, but, I prefer it if you didn't include this one in the book. And because they were part of their experience, but they didn't feel able to talk about them openly. And there was, a sense of, is it safe to talk about this? So this is why being able to share with each other is so helpful. This conversation continues in the next episode, and now we'll move to the chat. Time to time to many lines of interest in the goblin encounter and the events which led up to it. People often ask me, do fairy encounters take place in cities? And there have been a number of examples of those over the years, one of which I'll post in the show notes. But it does make this very interesting because we don't hear as much about fairy sightings in cities. I'd be very interested to hear from other people who have had encounters in urban areas. To begin with, the friends and family were already uncomfortable with the space and had expressed this to our guest. I do find it interesting that although she also felt unnerved and knew she was being watched, she felt inexplicably tied to that place in some way, as if it had sucked her in, and that she had a strong sense that that's where she needed to be at that time. I do think that we're drawn to these encounters, and for reasons we cannot explain, there is much meaning in them for us, even the disturbing experiences. We can gain a lot from them, and it's almost as if our deep part of ourselves is purposefully drawn there. I also feel that this is backed up by the sense of familiarity she felt, a recognition. Again, there's something about our deep selves that simply knows, even if we can't put that into words. That knowingness is an important aspect of these encounters. I feel it's the reason that many people report the sense of it seeming natural to see fairies. There isn't a heightened sense that can spin you out like a frightening human encounter of some sort. It's something different, like an intangible truth that resonates. At the time, our guest was moving through a liminal period of her life. She was between homes and had recently ended a relationship. In these spaces, we move from one state of being to another. The event itself took place on the threshold of the bathroom, and she noticed that they hung around the sliding door and didn't enter onto the stone floor of the bathroom. The fact that she noticed that is important, I feel. Her reaction afterwards, feeling embarrassed in case the telephone company would note her investigations into goblins, is so typical of how it feels right after one of these incidents. It's not something that people talk about, so it's very hard to work through it alone and figure out what on earth you just experienced. When she plucked up the courage to talk to people about it, in a paranormal event discussion setting, she was advised to contact me. She has since noted that although it's incredibly difficult to talk about it and it's had a deeply impactful effect on her, she feels relieved in a sense to be able to discuss it. And as we heard here, it has spurred her on to begin studies in this area. Was that why she was drawn to the encounter? We will never know. I know from my own experience that the overall impression, and I think message received, was that the little fairy man wanted me to see him. I never thought I would, years later, create a project and a podcast about fairy sightings, but it just so happens that my encounter did, in fact, in the end, lead me to doing something which is incredibly meaningful to me as a result of that event. It may be the same for our guest. I am bowled over by the message that the previous occupant had given her. You do know there are imps in houses. It's a very random thing to say to someone who's moving into a new apartment. It does seem to suggest that the outgoing tenant had experienced something during her stay there. If she did, again, it's a case of people feeling that they're not able to talk openly about these sorts of experiences. If it were a ghost, would she have said, "Oh, I think it's haunted"? We don't know. Our guest's fear that they may have followed her to her new residence is understandable, though I would add that those fears can be allayed somewhat by the fact that these goblins certainly hadn't followed the previous occupant. They had stayed put. I think it's about the location. I'm not party to the exact location of the residence, but I can share that the general area is close to the site of an old sacred well. The fact that the house is on a crossroads speaks volumes to me. Again, we're talking about a potent liminal space. Crossroads are well known for attracting this sort of phenomena. They seem to create places where beings from the other world can traverse to our world. The previous occupant had also had things go missing. It's interesting that jewellery went missing for our guest and the previous tenant. The instances of the kettle and TV turning on by themselves and the sound of gravel being thrown at the door, as well as the strawberry jam being shot out of the cupboard, these are classic phenomena. As we've discussed previously, in fairy encounters there are many crossovers with phenomena usually ascribed to poltergeist activity. Bigfoot beings are also known to throw stones. These are all very interesting aspects to note. Let's look at their description now. The goblins were described as being avocado green with hooked noses and pointed features with massive ears. They immediately sound like goblins or imps to me. Obviously we don't know enough about these beings to be categorising them into types, but 20th century folklorist Catherine Briggs initially did a pretty good job of offering some potential categories. Catherine Briggs' description of goblins, a general name for evil and malicious spirits, usually small and grotesque in appearance. But then we also have the boggart, a mischievous brownie almost exactly like a poltergeist in his habits, and they describe him in a story about a boggart having played tricks on everyone about the house, especially on the children. He would snatch away their bread and butter and upset their porringers and shove them into corners and cupboards, and yet not a glimpse of him was ever seen. And then if we look at imps, imp probably means a small devil, an offshoot of Satan, but the distinction between goblins or bogles and imps from hell is hard to make, and many in the Celtic countries as well as the English Puritans regarded all fairies as devils. The fairies of tradition often hover uneasily between the ghostly and the diabolic state. Well, there is a bit of everything of these descriptions in these goblins. So we can choose to call them goblins, but, as I say, we're not entirely sure of these categories, and it just helps to share these descriptions of them so we can start to form our own sense of what they are, but it's very difficult to pin them down. Going on other experiences, what people call imps are usually small, sometimes dark, troublesome fairies, and goblins can be dark and mischievous. Their faces are often pointed. What's the difference between goblins and gnomes, you might ask? Again, I don't have the answers, but from talking to people, when they are describing gnomes, they usually have the rounded, open features of the archetypal garden gnome. This is the sort that I saw. When experiences describe goblins, however, they describe pointy-faced, evil or troublesome-looking beings. They often have sharp, dirty nails and jagged teeth. They set deep fear into people, or they can do, although this has been overcome by making a strong statement that you are not scared of them, like our guest in episode 8, The Good, the Bad and the Tickly did. She refused to play into their hands, as it seemed to her that the being in her bedroom was taking pleasure in frightening her. Others have described this sort of behaviour too, but that is, of course, placing our own interpretation upon these beings, and the truth is that we simply don't understand their motives, or indeed whether they have any. Aspects of nature can be terrifying, both the elements within nature such as extreme weather and its capabilities to harm humans, and in the nature of wild animals who harbour no malicious intentions against human beings. Nature simply is. We cannot judge it. Two things came to mind when looking at the descriptions given of the goblins and the events in which they took place. The first is the bathing fairies of Ilkley, a real encounter of a gentleman called William Butterfield which took place in June of 1820, or potentially the year before or after. It has been written about extensively, and I recommend Simon Young's Boggart and Banshee episode on the encounter, which I'll link in the show notes. I first read about it in Janet Bord's Fairies, Real Encounters with Little People. This story also takes place in the vicinity of Sacred Wells, and I do wonder whether the similar description of the goblins hints at a type of being which is attracted to these areas, to do with water, and subsequently to bathrooms. This is a version of William's story that he told to his friend John Dobson. Just before dawn, around midsummer, William had gone to unlock the doors of the healing wells, which he had recently acquired in Ilkley, West Yorkshire. He was surprised to find that the key, instead of unlocking the door, kept turning round and round. Here is the subsequent report. Look out for the description of the beings. Then he endeavoured to push the door open, and no sooner did he push it slightly ajar than it was quickly pushed back again. At last, with one supreme effort, he forced it perfectly open, and back it flew with a great bang. Then whir, 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 such a noise and sight all over the water, and dipping into it was a lot of little creatures, dressed in green from head to foot, none of them more than 18 inches high, and making a chatter and a jabber thoroughly intelligible. They seemed to be taking a bath, only they bathed with all their clothes on. Soon, however, one or two of them began to make off, bounding over the walls like squirrels. Finding they were all making ready for decamping and wanting to have a word with them, he shouted at the top of his voice. Indeed, he declared afterwards he couldn't find anything else to say or do. "Hello there!" Then away went the whole tribe, helter-skelter, toppling and tumbling, heads over heels, heels over heads, and all the while making a noise not unlike that of a disturbed nest of young partridges. The sight was so unusual that he declared he either couldn't or daren't attempt to run after them. When the well had got quite clear of these strange beings, he ran to the door and looked to see where they had fled, but nothing was to be seen. He ran back into the bath to see if they had left anything behind, but there was nothing. The water lay still and clear, just as he had left it the previous night. He thought they might perhaps have left some of their clothing behind in their haste, but he could find none, and so he gave up looking, and commenced his usual routine of preparing the baths, not, however, without trotting to the door once or twice to see if they might be coming back, but he saw them no more. Now, the other thing that came to mind when thinking about the nature of these beings is the description in Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, well recognised by the lines, "We must not look at goblin men, we must not buy their fruits, who knows upon what soil they fed their hungry, thirsty roots." There's a part of the poem which describes how the goblins taunt Laura. There's a lewd vibe to it and puts me in mind of the behaviour of those goblins in the bathroom in London, standing on each other's shoulders and leering at our guests during a most private and personal act. When they reached where Laura was, they stood still upon the moss, leering at each other, brother with queer brother, signalling each other, brother with sly brother. And later, laughed every goblin when they spied her peeping, came towards her hobbling, flying, running, leaping, puffing and blowing, chuckling, clapping, crowing, clucking and gobbling, mopping and mowing, full of airs and graces, pulling wry faces, demure grimaces. There are a number of other modern encounters which share similar attributes to this encounter, and I will be reading these on the Patreon bonus. Come and join our community there. In the next episode, we'll hear the second half of the conversation. I hope you'll join us then. Sometimes the stories on this podcast help us to open up to new ways of thinking. For me, this is one of those episodes. These are the sorts of encounters that folks find it really hard to talk about because they're so affecting and because they sound so far-fetched. But these are real encounters, and they are happening regularly. I'd be so interested to hear from anyone else who's had a goblin encounter. There's never any need to talk about it on the podcast. We can simply include it in the research. In these times, it feels like truths are rising to the surface, whether this is comfortable or not, because it's necessary to acknowledge them in order to move on. So, it makes sense to consider what we might refer to as the darker side of fairy at this time. We can reach deep understandings from leaning into these experiences. People who have had frightening brushes with the unknown say that it changes them forever. The time we're living through feels unnerving and at times frightening to observe, and yet again there's this deep sense of knowingness, a recognition. Human beings have lived through these times before, and I feel the old fairy tales hold a lot of useful symbolism at this time. It's almost like they were written for these times, these cycles of evolution. I'm thinking a lot lately about the story of Sleeping Beauty when the entire palace, perhaps the world, is enchanted, and it is only true love which can awaken them. And I'm thinking of the Emperor's New Clothes, which is a stark reminder of that peculiar phenomenon where human beings can refuse to see what is clearly right in front of their eyes. Fairy tales can unlock something deep within us, and in the same way, the truth of these strange encounters, which have remained taboo for so long, can free us too. So, trust what you see, let love free you from any enchantment, and always remain curious.